Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to our latest episode of All Things Policy. I'm Harshit Kukreja, and today as my guest I have my colleague Leah. It's a debate in all things policy and I think on podcasts in general. Hi Leah, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Harshit?
Fun. So a few weeks ago we were having a conversation around sex ed and how maybe in this particular case you need some kind of government a curriculum based nudge. Maybe you need it, maybe not. We'll discuss it on this podcast. And so Leah also has a lot of experience in teaching. She has taught in Teach for India, and I think you spent a good 1.5, 2 years there, right?
2 years, yeah.
Was it fun?
It was fun. I learned a lot. It was a great experience being exposed to the education system at the grassroots level, and not just within the classroom, but at the community level, at the local corporation level, interacting with the parents, interacting with the community, the school, basically all stakeholders. I think there's a lot to learn, a lot of perspective to build, and it's especially helped when working here at Takshashila. So in building perspective and understanding policy. So yeah, I definitely derived a lot of joy and from my experience at Teach for India.
So this was Pune, right?
Yes, Pune. From 2017 to 2019.
I still think it's Pune, but yeah, all right. Yeah. So let us start from TFI.
Okay.
Do you think the schools you were helping out with or were teaching students in, did they have adequate sex ed curriculum? Did they have sex ed in their curriculum? Second, were they doing it? Were they teaching the curriculum part?
So a curriculum in sex education did not exist while I was there.
Officially or they didn't?
Officially.
Okay.
Officially did not exist, and there was no one teaching it as well.
This is a Maharashtra state school.
Yeah,
Okay.
in Pune. So in Kothurud. So while a curriculum didn't exist, as Teach for India teachers, I know that some of us tried to introduce it in conversation with students whenever a situation or a question related would come up. But as far as I know, a curriculum did not exist in the schools that I was working.
So your conversations around sex ed were reactionary.
Yeah, reactionary mostly because, for example, in the school that I taught, there was an organization that came sort of as like a volunteer event that they held where they were distributing sanitary pads to students. And I remember the boys were kind of kicked out of the classroom and kept elsewhere, while the girls were kept in the classroom and they were just handed out pads by this person. And the boys didn't understand why they were being kept out of the classroom. And of course, this was I taught 4th and 5th grade. So they were at an age where they might not have understood, because some of them also did not know what sex was. And I found that there's a lot of a conversation that had to begin at a very rudimentary level. There was a lot to have to talk to them about, and we're not also really taught on how to handle a conversation like that.
So did they ask you, like when the boys came back, did they ask you why you kicked them out? Was there a conversation around it? And do you think it was important to separate and only give the menstrual product to the females?
I think maybe there could have been some of the girls were equally not in the know, as in they did not know how a pad would be used, because again it was 5th standard. So it's relatively young for most of them in my class. So I would have thought actually a session with them separately, yes, made sense, but maybe the boys could have been brought in later, and kind of if there were professionals there, they could have navigated the conversation.
Okay, I think I might disagree a little on that, because that is the same reason why you have like single gender schools.
Right.
I definitely think the parents would not, in a government sort of a state board school in the periphery of Pune, I don't think the parents would be very happy when there's a conversation around sex ed or menstrual products with the boys also, the males also present in the room.
But then I suppose we could discuss how that can be implemented actually in schools or at,
Yeah.
at an education level, such that it's not separate but inclusive to all and it removes the taboo altogether. I suppose we could introduce that into our discussion today.
So before we proceed, can you give us a short TLDR on what sex ed is? What does it include? What it doesn't?
So, by my understanding, sex education would include an understanding on sexual intercourse, the reproductive systems, gender fluidity, sexuality, menstrual cycles, and yeah, that's about it. Do you have anything to add as a doctor?
Yeah. Also an emphasis on contraception.
Yeah.
Plus an emphasis on consent. Plus identifying sexual abuse, trying to prevent sexual abuse, and who to reach out.
Yeah, exactly.
For if you think sort of the at least a good touch, bad touch conversation, and telling them so we are open to. You can come to us. Teachers telling them you can come to us if you feel this is happening with you, or you can go to your parents, or maybe your grandparents, your aunt, or somebody, so that you can just go and have that conversation with you. Other than this, I don't think anything is too important. And yeah, so when you're talking about gender fluidity and everything, I think because it is 2023, 20 years ago, I would not have said this, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. I don't think I existed 30 years ago, but yeah, still. So 20 or 30 years ago, I would not have said this, at least not 20, 30 years ago, that now it is quite important to introduce and include LGBTQ rights and gender diversity and gender inclusion into a lot of conversations.
Yes.
I remember, I think this was 8th standard. So I studied in a CBSE school. This was, so the teacher made sure that the chapter on reproduction was as dry as it could be. There was no conversation. Even though our biology teacher was like quite conversational, she would all your doubts and blah blah blah. But she didn't want to have a conversation on reproduction in 8th class with a mixed crowd. So she just wanted to like get it over with, and a lot of parts she also I think skipped or did it. How was your experience of sex ed in schools?
I mean, in my school itself, I don't think, I mean, there wasn't a specific class dedicated to it exclusively, but it was part of the curriculum in in biology. So the teacher did cover it to some extent. But again, like you said, there wasn't really a conversation about it. In the school that I taught, like I said, there wasn't a curriculum and there wasn't any professionals telling or teaching students about it in any age group. Maybe fourth or fifth standard, some might deem too young, but for the older grades, at least the teenagers, there was no conversation of the sort, by my understanding.
Yeah, even for me, it was only reproduction, process of reproduction, nothing about consent, and maybe not a lot about. There was something about contraception, but it was all theoretical, no practical sort of things that this step one, this is what you do, second, that you cannot just, even if I don't think the society wants it, but even if some section of some society in some place wants to like not want teenagers to have sex, you cannot just wish them away. You have to teach them. You have to assume that it is not possible.
Yeah.
And you have to like give them education about a lot of things about contraception and a lot of things.
Yeah. So as a doctor, Harshit, have you ever been in a situation or seen a situation with a patient or in your immediate vicinity in a hospital or in the healthcare sector of where a lack of sex education has had a huge impact on a patient or a person that you've seen around you?
Yeah, so I used to work in basically the emergency department in a large government hospital. So we used to get cases of teenagers or basically like 16, 17-year-old kids with missed pregnancies, and they used to walk into the emergency room because that was the only time where they could come in when their parents wouldn't. No,
Right.
yeah, you couldn't just. So if you want to go to the gynecology sort of ops department, you have to like wait in OPD and blah blah blah, and you basically have to spend whole day, and they used to just like request and ask you if they can like talk to you. And
what about the financial aspect? There should be a fee to that has to be paid, right? And especially with young younger girls, there might be an issue with how, I mean, where they're getting the money from to pay for a consultancy or whatever.
So I've always worked in government hospital, and in Delhi, you don't have a fee for.
Right.
So there's no fee for consultation. There's no fee for medication, and there's also no fee for any. Basically, all of the tests which are done in house. These people, they used to usually come, and what it also depended if there was a friendly gynecologist around. She used to do a urine pregnancy test and maybe tell you something, and then they used to proceed, and eventually this was all because of the lack of sex ed part. If you would know what contraceptions to use and what you could do, you could have handled it better and not come in like when you're 2 months into your missed cycle and you're coming in. So it also becomes a little difficult. How do you want to proceed? Yeah, so Leah, before we continue our conversation, let us take a short break and then we'll come back. Hey listeners, welcome back to our episode of ATP. I have my colleague Leah with me. We were talking about sex ed. We wanted to eventually talk about sex ed in school. We were describing how what is the current situation, what are the dangers we are facing because of lack of sex ed, and what exactly sex ed is. So continuing on our conversation, Leah, I what I've read and what I think data indicates is, and whatever rulings I have read and whatever curriculums I've gone through, I don't think there's a concrete proposal to add any kind of rudimentary sex ed to any. I'm not talking about biology lessons. I'm talking about sex ed, in which they teach you how to navigate things. They teach you about sex and they teach you about everything related to sex. I don't think there's a sort of a solid component added to the curriculum anywhere.
Yeah.
I recently read a Kerala High Court ruling. This is 2022, and 2023 also there was some follow up on that. The court basically is now telling the executive to include some kind of sex education in its curriculum so that children now at least know. So Leah, so we were talking about how what are the advantages of like good sex ed. Can you like elaborate a little on that? What do you think? If we introduce sex ed into the curriculum, what will that lead into?
Well, it definitely, according to studies I've seen, it definitely leads to safer sex practices, decrease in sexual activity, in the sense that it's more moderated and right. So, with a better or a inclusive and comprehensive sex ed curriculum, adolescents and young people are seen to freely make informed decisions on all matters related to their sexuality and reproduction, and therefore they do require sex ed, and that's why we know it's tried and tested and that it works. It's about execution, I think, at this point in schools.
It's about execution, but we also want to introduce that in curriculum, right?
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, the central government had developed the Adolescence Education Program, the AEP, in association with UNICEF for the implementation in all secondary and higher secondary schools, of which the objectives were to ensure the integration of a sex education curriculum in teacher education courses, was to organize activities for life skills developments to help students acquire an authentic knowledge base about reproductive and sexual health, including HIV, AIDS, and substance abuse, and also inculcate in students essential life skills to develop healthy attitudes and responsible behavior towards reproductive and sexual health issues.
So basically, they also added a component about sexual transmissible diseases. Yeah. Yeah, that should be a part. That is, I think that is also taught covered in some extent to basic biology 101 about reproductive system.
Yeah.
So AEP means adolescence education program.
Yeah.
I think there were some certain hurdles in that program, and they started it one time in 2005, shut it in 2007
Yeah, I think
or
there
8.
were objections to, on the grounds of it there being explicit content, and I think parents might not have been comfortable with it.
But how can you teach sexual education
Yeah.
without there being sexual education in the content?
I think that is a cultural hurdle that we need to figure out like how to overcome. I think more conversations need to take
Mm.
place day to day, open conversations. For example, for on my part, I talk about menstrual health and
Hmm.
menstruation very openly amongst everyone,
Hmm.
just as a way to remove any discomfort or I mean, I do it in a comfortable way, or I try to anyway, such that there's no taboo around it or discomfort where someone doesn't like to hear about it. And that's just something that I do on my part. I don't know how effective it has been, but what do you think about that?
About your interventions or sex ed in, yeah.
No, no,
So, uh,
about having conversations openly.
yeah, I think for that to happen, you should have at least some evidence and science, basically logic
Yeah.
around sex ed to be taught to school children. Yeah, so I think it's quite important. I did think one of the first ways to go about is everything happens in sort of education in India. First, it goes via CBSE or NCRT.
Hmm.
So maybe an explicit intention to introduce sex ed, and then a module which talks a lot about sex ed. Maybe you have maybe it's part of biology, maybe it's a compulsory module that you have to complete when you're in 6th or 7th class.
Hmm.
But once I think NCRT puts it in its curriculum, then eventually I think it would be adopted by a lot of state boards. But I'm a little unsure that how a coercive government sort of a measure, a top down approach, would go with a lot of parents, would go with schools. Will the teacher be willing to teach it? What if the student goes home and tells her parents that this is what they're taught, this is what they have been taught? Will the parents object? Will they? I think, for instance, adolescents education program was also shut down in the middle because of a lot of parental pressure.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't have a clear idea in my head. How do you prevent? How do you make it more acceptable in society? Maybe with adolescent program, you also have adult sexual ed programs
Yeah.
in which you emphasize more on consent, maybe more on women friendly sort of behavior, maybe more on genders and less on the biology and but also that, but less on that. So maybe more on awareness, sexually transmissible diseases, contraceptions, anatomy in general.
There was actually a film that came out on Netflix a few years ago called Period End of Sentence, where it's based in the name of the community is, I mean, it has slipped my mind, but basically there's like a menstrual health crisis, as it were, in that community because the use of sanitary napkins wasn't really a practice there, and then so they were using cloth, and then the cloth was discarded, and which contributed to the landfills and waste in the community. And so a man taught them, a group of women who were willing, so built an entrepreneurial venture, as it were, in manufacturing organic cotton pads, sanitary pads, and selling them to people within the community and in neighboring villages as well. And I think it not only empowered the women themselves, but also made them more, I feel it made them more comfortable with a process that is only natural, whereas it's perceived as taboo.
Yeah.
Whereas the men in those women's lives got more involved in it, they wanted to know what was going on.
Mhm.
And so through that, like a sort of, it became like a percolation of understanding and education through this venture that these women were on. So I think it is possible in an organic way, in a unsuspecting way, as it were, to introduce
I think then
this
the
knowledge base.
conversation just boils down to like what are the prevailing social norms, and
Yeah.
but I still think that it's a, even if you don't focus on it, lack of resources and everything else,
Yeah.
you cannot bring a lot of social change from top down. But I still think educating, maybe adding to the curriculum and making sure that the teachers at least make a little effort, maybe teacher training, add it to teacher training programs. Teachers at least make an effort to teach it to the children. Maybe the parents don't accept it. Maybe they should be, eventually they'll become okay with it. Maybe remove whatever the teacher, the parents think are more objectionable things, and maybe just treat them the bare basic minimums. So then that would be a good stepping point to introduce the curriculum, starting with maybe CBSE, and maybe if the Supreme Court ruling plays out nicely, maybe from down south, and then eventually it percolates upwards and spreads to the whole country.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I still think it's something which can be taught, and something which should be taught because of two reasons. First of all, we have the highest population. Sort of now, I think we are about to cross China's population.
Yeah.
And second of all, because now, and oh yeah, surprisingly, the latest government National Family Health Survey data, the fifth one, says that our total fertility rate is 2.1, which basically turns out to be the replacement rate. It's, I think, 2 and 2.1 is the replacement rate. It's somewhere, don't quote me on this, it's somewhere around that. But yeah, I think eventually, if our fertility rate falls a lot, and we don't want a small working class population supporting a large dependent population, we have to have this conversation, and then you modulate how many kids you want to have, how do you want to have them, and how do you want to raise them, and a lot of things.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely raises a lot of questions. Yeah, so I think that concludes our conversation in a way.
Yeah, I think there are no easy answers in bringing a cultural and social change
Yeah.
to this issue, but I think it is a worthwhile sort of pursuit, and it has a lot of benefits, and maybe it will ruffle a few feathers, and who cares, but the benefits far outweigh the whatever the costs are.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Leah,
Thank you
for
so much, Harshit.
coming to our podcast, and we hope that you'll be a repeat guest in a lot of our podcasts.
I hope to be.
Yeah. Thank you, listeners, for chiming in.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.